Okay, fabulous. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and apologies, I won't be able to stay too long. I have to run in about 25 minutes to a prior engagement, but when I did get Nikki's invitation, I thought, well, he's always putting together fascinating events and really interesting groups of people, so thought I would jump on and at least contribute what I can to this fantastic series. And it sounds like an amazing group as well too that are intersecting in such interesting ways. My background is that I'm originally from Hong Kong. I was born and raised there, but also spent quite a bit of time in Canada, the US, and then back to mainland China for about 8 years, Hong Kong for about another 7 years, and then recently in the last year and a half, I've moved to Australia. So I'm based in Melbourne. I'm doing a postgraduate program at the University of Melbourne, where I am looking at urban planning and policy issues, and then more specifically within planning, I am fascinated by transport. And I thought I would share a little bit about some of my research recently, which is in the autonomous vehicle space, specifically looking at some of the big questions, I suppose, that it's prompting in the policy debate space. So I'll keep the presentation fairly short so that at least we maybe have some time for a couple of questions at the end. And I will do a little screen share in a second. Let's see. Let me know if everyone is able to see my screen. Yeah, okay, great. So I'll start off with a little story. This is a story of Sara Lee. She, fortunately, had misjudged the right turn, and just as she thought that oncoming traffic was clear, she turned behind a large truck, and another vehicle had failed to stop behind it and slammed right into her. Unfortunately, the reality is that this could have been the case for a lot of people, and more car accidents happen than I think we want to admit to. In fact, 91% of errors on the road are due to some form of human error. So the question that I would put out there is, what if we could actually avoid this? Does that have to be? And then I guess this question of, why do I care about even the space of automobility or even the space of autonomous vehicles? I suppose most recently and most personally, I've experienced it quite firsthand through my father. During this period of COVID-19 has actually experienced a reduction in his ability to get around, so he can't actually drive anymore. And I've realized the challenges that has put for him. He lives about 14 kilometers away from the nearest town in the rural part of Australia. And even being able to get access to his groceries and so forth have created a real challenge. But I suppose to put it in context as well, thinking about the way that cities are changing, thinking about the way that cities are designed, it's hard to avoid talking about the automobile in many ways, for better or for worse, and many planners would bemoan the fact that probably a lot of our cities are very much designed around the automobile. But if you go back in history, so the first automobile, of course, was 1908, Ford Model T, and it only took about 20 years from its introduction to reach 1 in every 2 households. And as a result, many of the US cities have really been designed around the automobile. In places like Australia as well too, we've followed a very similar model. And then this question of, okay, so fast forward to 2020 today, why should we care about autonomous vehicles, automated vehicles? Well, there are a lot of different predictions out there, and optimists are suggesting that by even as close as 2030, we might see significant adoption of AVs on the road. The various different reports are suggesting by 2040, maybe 4 in 10 vehicles on the road will be autonomously driven. Some studies are suggesting that currently the $54 billion industry in 10 years' time could be 10 times that amount. So I think, you read all the news and you see the advancement in technology, and you start to wonder what are some of the implications of this. I suppose the other big area, in addition to looking at obviously how it could change safety on roads, is that transport accounts for almost 1/3 of greenhouse gases, according to a recent report by the EPA that was looking at combined transport across freight and public transport and private transport as well. That's a very significant contributor to the impact on the environment. And this question around, once again, what if we could actually reduce the number of vehicles on the road? What if, does the promise of shared mobility, for example, offer up some of those possibilities? Tesla made a very interesting announcement. Elon made a very interesting announcement last year at Tesla Autonomy Day. And he basically said, okay, two things. In the future, for those of you that will buy a autonomous, buy a Tesla in the future, number one, if we replace the actual computer hardware within the car, you won't have to upgrade a whole new car. You can simply interchange the existing system. Okay, well, that's interesting. So you don't have to purchase a whole new car. The second thing he basically said was that, and when this was April last year, in 2020, they were planning to roll out their initial pilot of an AV robo-taxi fleet. And so at the flip of a switch, your private car will go from being a private car to one that is actually part of a public fleet. Now, what is that essentially saying? Well, it's challenging the notion of private ownership and saying, all of a sudden, people no longer would have to view their car as a depreciating asset, but actually an investment, one that they could actually, once again, begin to make money from. Now, the other thing I want to sort of pause for a second and put in perspective is if you look at the average car sits in a garage 95% of the day, either parked in a garage, on the street, at home, 95% of the day. Now, when it's being driven, on average, and Australia is not very good at this, we have 1.2 people per car. I think in Europe it averages slightly higher, 1.4 people. But once again, if you look at that in terms of the second most expensive investment that a lot of people make in their lives after their home, that's a capacity utilization of less than 2%. So how do we ever get there? So once again, this question of could we actually see a future where people are starting to share mobility, where there's actually demand responsive transport that is creating much better routing for everything from buses to trams to private vehicles to minibuses? That I think is really a very big question. Of course, it raises a lot of very interesting questions and debates, and these range from data privacy issues, data sharing, to issues of access and social equity as well. I think a lot of these debates are, we're just touching on the surface of them right now, and you could imagine a scenario. Taxis, for example, are already notorious for not wanting to send their drivers into certain areas because they find that they have more complaints or more vandalism issues, or once again, different neighborhoods have different clientele. So you could imagine a scenario where if it were entirely driven by the private sector and certain parts of a city experience also more challenges for their vehicles, what if they started doing digital redlining, for example, in certain parts of the city were inaccessible to a basic form of public transportation, or what potentially could be a form of public transportation. So I think these are complex issues that are starting to be debated now as planners and policymakers are thinking about the potential transition to AVs. And I suppose it's also a question too of from a policy angle, who's leading the conversation, right? Is it going to be the private sector and the public sector sort of responding with regulatory measures put in place to try to ensure that all the questions are figured out ahead of time or addressed? Who decides, who wins, who loses as this future rolls out, I think are really critical questions. So I'll stop there. It's more a primer, I suppose, to raise a couple of issues that are coming up. I think probably one of the biggest ones for planners, and the reason the reasons why there's resistance from transport authorities to, I mean, there already are a wide proliferation of tests and trials that are happening all around the world. Australia right now has about 30 AV trials going on. I think in the US there are about 80 companies now at this point that are doing tests and trials. So it's not that it's not happening, but it is also a question that relates to changes in, for example, land use and integrated transport planning. Will AVs end up competing with public transport, for example? Will they actually add more vehicles to the road? There's a very interesting example of a Canadian city, a small, well, 200,000 people, Innisfil, that decided to experiment with replacing all public transport with subsidizing Uber for 6 months. And it was an interesting exercise because they were concerned about how much they were spending as a city which on public transport, low density development, so it's very hard to justify the very expensive investments. The experiment in Uber was very popular, and a lot of people ended up adopting the subsidies, but it scaled much quicker than they anticipated. And the long story was that they found that if they continued to invest in public transport on the same trajectory, it would have been a lot more cost efficient than the Uber service. And the Uber service actually ended up adding more cars to the road. So this question of, will we add more vehicles? Will people choose to live further away from cities? Will they exacerbate urban sprawl? These are questions that are very much at the forefront of planning debates right now. So I'll leave it at that. I think there's a lot of promise potentially for an AV future, but it's one that has to be really considered with a discussion between not just the private sector, but obviously the public sector working very closely together as well.
That was so compressed, so much information.
It's a lot. It's a big topic. It's the subject of my thesis right now. And I guess I've also been looking at case studies specifically of places like Singapore, Netherlands as well, recently, and some US case studies as well, in terms of their application, not just for Australia, but global cities in general that are running tests and trials. But yeah, so I guess I'll open it up there at that point to maybe some questions or a discussion that we could have.
You're mentioning one point. I think that's not only related to the automotive industry or mobility, and that's the third generation of ownership, right? We own things that we use, and then the millennials said that ownership is a burden. So why own things where you only need them 5% of the time? So have access to everything, and access became bigger than ownership. And now with technology where we're going, it feels like, and I call this distributed ownership, where you might own 5 cars, but when you need a car, you might not take yours, but your 5 cars make money for you, and everything you own is something that makes money for you, which applies for cars, but also maybe applies for apartments or any other. How close does it get to your body that you accept things that everything you own makes money for you? Right. You use blank, and while you're not using blank, how much can it make money for you in the meantime?
Yeah, no, I think that's very much a trend that we're starting to see in terms of, obviously a shift to how people perceive ownership of assets, and so people talk about mobility as a service, right? In the future, will they be subscription-based models that we look at? I think Singapore is probably a very interesting example for a lot of reasons. They were one of the first cities in the 90s to introduce electronic road pricing. So essentially, every single vehicle in Singapore is tagged, and basically the way that they manage congestion in Singapore is they use market mechanisms to price it. So if you're traveling into the city at a certain time of day, you'll be given a tax levy essentially, and I think that that's an indication of eventually what is going to come as more and more AV trials roll out. Is that traditionally a lot of local government revenues are subsidized by things like parking fees, right? But you can imagine, once again, if we transition to a future where people aren't parking anymore, then what's going to replace that form of government revenue? Well, it's probably going to be something like curbside dynamic pricing, where vehicles are charged based on when they drop people off and how long they stop for, right? So I think these business models are all going to change in the future, whether it's how people subscribe to mobility as a service, or whether it's how governments are even taxing that service, for example. Yeah.
You have an amazing chasm, and I'm curious what you think about kind of how long it will take and where the journey will go. You have Mumbai, let's say Mumbai on one end, where you have TikToks that turn 4-lane streets into 18-lane streets randomly, being more disconnected to the world. And then you have places like Singapore, where you pay $100,000 every 10 years just to own a car, just to have a license, the ID. Where everything is so much under control that it becomes natural for people that things take their own control, right? When everything is under control anyways, and the car takes control over itself, it's like, wow, that's a natural progress. And they're living in the same planets, on the same continent, actually.
Yeah.
Also to each other than I'm from Mumbai. And how's the transition? Because right now what's happening with COVID is that I call it the era of hyper acceleration. Right? Everything that was supposed to happen in 5 years is happening now. And then we're heading a phase 2, which seems obvious for many. I'm one of them, that we have another lockdown, which will make it another hyper acceleration, right? Because we're not talking about how long do we have to wait to go back to where we've been before. It's more of the question of what are the things that needed to be done right now, because when we call this payday, it's just tip of the iceberg with all the things we're heading towards. So we don't have the usual time that we're used to have, right? Where one transition might have taken 15 years until everyone adapted to it, or longer. Now it feels like one sort of the world are 5 years ahead of technology, and then there are others who are 30 years behind technology. And all of a sudden, everything must happen now.
No, it's a fascinating question to ponder. So, what could the rollout look like, and how could it be staged over the next, let's say, even 30, 40 years? So, to give an idea of, where is the technology now? So, Waymo, one of the leaders in the field, is logging 11,000 miles per disengagement, and that's basically double the number of miles that they logged the previous year. And if you compare that to human drivers, that's already safer than human drivers, but you're not comparing apples and oranges, because they're very different test conditions that AVs are currently operating in than complex urban roads and environments. Although some cities are starting to roll them out as well too, in some of those more complex environments too. A number of Chinese cities, for example. But I think a likely roadmap in a let's say optimistic scenario is that in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years, what we can see is that there's going to be a much wider scale adoption of AV tests and trials across cities all around the world. And some will be in a better position to take advantage of that because of combination of physical infrastructure, but also consumer acceptance and societal acceptance. The digital infrastructure obviously will have to facilitate that as well too, and 5G and other technologies supporting vehicle-to-vehicle infrastructure communication and vehicle-to-vehicle communication is going to have to be there as well. So I think that's the 5 to 10 year period. You're going to see a lot more trials, and what you're going to see is that and this is already happening in areas like retirement villages, in hospitals, or Singapore, in some of the public housing estates, where there's a defined route. They're already running shuttle services, and collecting a fair bit of data. I think what you're also going to see is dedicated laneways, and this will start with. The reality is that the thing that we also have to consider is that it's not just vehicles, but public transport is also leading the automation revolution too. So a quarter of trains in Asia are already autonomous, right? I mean, the aviation industry, it's been autonomous for decades. The and so what you're going to see is things like dedicated laneways for bus rapid transit or trams. Autonomous trams are one area that the city of Melbourne is looking at right now, and actually sourcing them from a Chinese company in a city called Zhengzhou. They're electric trams right now that cost about 1/10 that of traditional trams, because you don't have to actually, they're rubber wheeled trams. I mean, they look, in some ways they're like a bus, but they look like a tram. They're electric, they charge at 15 minutes on each station, and essentially those will be, I think, a precursor to establishing dedicated laneways for eventually turning those into autonomous trams and then running other AVs through those lanes. I think you're going to see in 10 to 15 years, that's when greenfield sites and new developments will start to mandate entirely AV zones, and there'll be geo-fenced areas. I think a lot of the complications happen when you have AVs plus human drivers, because the reality is humans are just unpredictable. I mean, think about the complexity of when you approach an intersection and you give a head nod to someone else. Those subtle forms of communication, it's very hard for a machine to pick up, even with the most sophisticated machine learning algorithms. So I think a much safer way that rollouts will happen is entirely geofenced areas. And then after that stage, then I think cities are already going to be experimenting with putting them in fairly public areas, because the consumer acceptance and the societal acceptance is another piece. It's going to have to go hand in hand. You could imagine a scenario where, let's say, fatal couple of crashes or terrible physical or sexual assault cases on a vehicle, and all of a sudden there's a big public backlash against AVs, and it doesn't take a lot to in some ways sway the public discourse as well too around these types of things. And imagine then if the investment starts to dry up in this sector as well. So I think there's understandably a lot of caution that has to proceed with the industry, even though in some ways the technology has come a long ways in the last 10 years, particularly since the first DARPA challenge, which really kicked off excitement in the industry. But I anticipate that cities that are thinking ahead about how is it going to work with public transport, right? Is it going to be an effective, for example, last mile connection to existing train or transit-oriented development nodes, right? And how are stations going to be redesigned, right? These are sort of the details, if you will, the details of effective implementation from a city perspective. But those that are at least having these discussions now and planning for it, we'll start to see progress. Yeah.
Johan is asking, Vincent, what is your take on the fact that with smart cities, the whole city will be equipped with sensors? How is the issue of privacy seen in your region?
The issue of privacy, yeah. So this is also a fascinating debate, and I think we're seeing it exacerbated, like you said, Nikki, because of things like COVID as well too. Australia was one of the first, if not, I think the first Western democracy to roll out, a very wide contact tracing app, and I think the UK is also doing it as well too. And I think Singapore was, well, of course, China first, and then eventually Singapore. And so you're starting to see these fascinating debates around privacy come straight back to the surface. And I think in times of public health crises, people are willing to put aside a certain degree of civil liberties to accept that there's going to be a greater degree of public health provision that is accounted for. But then once again, what will that mean for AVs? Because obviously these are vehicles that are loaded with sensors. 17 cameras on each one of these vehicles. The roads themselves are going to have sensors, beacons for roadworks and so forth. So we're entering into a world where there's going to be so much data that is collected that companies are going to see obviously opportunities for advertising. And I think that one of the things that's going to have to happen, and this is already happening with things like GDPR and so forth, the legislation is being put in place around things like who manages the data, who owns it, how long do they, how is it stored, who has access to it, what are issues in terms of, right to forget. And these same kinds of debates are going to have to happen as well too with data that's collected around AVs. I think we're just at the beginning of some of these discussions, and it's hard to say exactly which way they'll go. But I'm seeing at least a greater tolerance for, at least in Australia, people being increasingly okay with some of the data being used, as long as the right provisions are put in place for answering some of the concerns around these questions.
We in the chat we have a lot of conversation about the unintended consequences, like trucks who cause congestions, and now they can drive it during the night because, right, if they're autonomous, you can put them on the street in the night where the infrastructure is available, because most of the other private users are not taking the capacity. Or languages. Right now we have languages and cultures. When we talk about communications between drivers and pedestrians, there are languages and cultures, but cars, when they negotiate traffic, they will speak one language. Where's going to be the interface to the human, right? Because there will be, I see the future of cars not only in transporting people and goods, because cars will be equipped with sensors and they will be data mining sources for almost everything because they're in the motion. They will, weather, street condition, seismographic activity, whatever it is, they will constantly be able to mine information that's relevant for a lot of industries, with or without something or someone in the car. But then there are people, there are humans. How is the interface going to change between mobility and the human?
Yeah, that's also a fascinating question. I remember my first experience, and it didn't happen too long ago, of stepping into an autonomous vehicle. University of Melbourne has one that they run for some pilot trials, and it was being showcased at Melbourne Design Week. And I got in, and it's a shuttle basically. Doors close, and you can fit about 8 people inside, and it started moving. It was going very slow, and then someone actually ran out in front of the vehicle, and it came to a fairly abrupt. It did stop. It did not hit the person, I think that the experience that people are going to have is going to vary quite widely, right? And different demographics are going to respond to the experiences very differently too, right? In some ways, while people are saying, oh, well, they'd be perfect for trialing in places like retirement villages, they're finding that a lot of people that live in retirement wouldn't step anywhere close to an autonomous vehicle. They don't trust it at all. And yet, they're also becoming a mainstay in places like in Singapore. They're testing them in Sentosa Island and then Gardens by the Bay, which are 2 very highly touristed attractions, right? And I suppose, that's where, when you're traveling and you're experiencing new things, that's sort of an ideal environment, I suppose, to try out a new technology. But it's not just, it's not just the experience of stepping into these vehicles too, but it's also, obviously there's the utopian visions of being able to work in these vehicles or sleep or so forth. And, some of them may eventually go in that direction as well too, but I think more realistically what you're going to see in terms of, from a transport planning perspective, is can these vehicles have a wider variety of capacity and sizes, so that you can create demand responsive public transport routes? I think that's the very exciting thing to be thinking about, because if you look at, for example, the bus network in a city like Melbourne, it's terrible. It hasn't been invested in for years, and reforms have been trying to happen, but yet the amount of physical space, if you had a full capacity bus versus that number of vehicles on the road, it just doesn't compare, right? So, but once again, people aren't taking buses because the routes are so long and they're circuitous and they're not running enough services. So once again, if we could actually leverage the technology that we have today to create much more demand responsive bus routes, and it doesn't have to be a big 40-person bus. It could be a van. It could be a minibus, right? It could be a 4-seater. I think that's where there's a tremendous amount of potential to persuade the consumer at the end of the day that that it's a much more viable form of mobility and public transport. Yeah.
Winnie, even though you're not saying stop, I want to respect your time. We already took 15 minutes over your initial time limit. Thank you so much. There is a lot going on in the chat. I will share that with you.
Yes. I'd be happy to continue the discussion offline. And sorry we didn't get a chance to get to some of the really great questions that were there as well too. But once again, please feel free to share my details with the group, Nikki, and look forward to hearing how the future series goes as well.
Very good. Thank you so much. All the best to where is it right now? Is it Melbourne or Sydney?
I'm in Melbourne. Yeah.
Good. And that's tomorrow already. Is this at a Saturday on your end?
We're Friday, but about to head to catch up with a few friends for dinner. Yeah.
All right. Enjoy. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for the invitation. Bye. Have a good one.